It's time again for the Insiders with Chuck Chvala and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership.
Hi, I'm Scott Jensen, former Assembly Speaker.
And I'm Chuck Chvala, former Senate Majority Leader.
And we're the Insiders. Well, Chuck, the elections, huge victory for the Supreme Court, for Chris Taylor and the Democrats. What's that going to mean for Wisconsin?
Well, first, I have to apologize to Judge Taylor. I predicted that she would have a 15-point margin. Some people thought it would be 10, but I predicted 15. But of course, she outdid that by 5 points. She's got a 20-point margin. This is unheard of. You got to go way back to have this. It certainly has not been the case in these recent times. It was a remarkable victory. And of course, the consequences for this are huge. The 14-year nightmare that Democrats saw when a 50-50 state was gerrymandered, so you had nearly veto-proof majorities in the Assembly and Senate, that will not happen now. Now, formally, they have to win one more seat, but that's pretty clear that Pedro Colon or whoever the progressive nominee will be next year is going to win that. And that will give the progressives control of the Wisconsin Supreme Court until at least 2033. Which means that when redistricting happens in 2031, there will not be a partisan gerrymander, because if there is, that will be struck down by a progressive court. So that's a huge implication for something that's not seen for right now. But the other more short-term impact of this election is that in the fall, this is not just going to be a wave. This is going to be a tsunami. Democrats are going to do very well across the state. Derek Van Orden, there's been talk about whether he might be able to be beaten. No, he's gone. If you go back, we don't have time to go through it, but look at all of the margins for Chris Taylor in the Derek Van Orden seat, and you can see that there's just no way this guy is not going to make it. It's now a question of who's going to win the Democratic primary. And of course, Rebecca Cook has been out there for quite a while and done quite well. So there are enormous implications from this. And what it tells you is that Donald Trump, the bottom line is Donald Trump has broken the Republican brand. Now, you might say, well, these are nonpartisan races. But you know what? Somebody pointed out to me, that's not true. These have not been nonpartisan races for about the last 5 or 6 races. The Republican Party, one of the candidates for Supreme Court, ran their race out of the Republican Party headquarters. Clearly, the Dems are on the side of Chris Taylor. So what this tells you is that this fall is going to be a very difficult time for Republicans. And I'll tell you what, if I'm Democrats, the only political malpractice they're in danger of right now is not having a viable candidate in every seat in the state legislature, because any place could come into play. I noticed the Democrats in the Senate are working on the 25th up in Superior and all that area. But I think you should have somebody on every place in the ballot. Clearly, something serious is happening out there. Now, I would not predict that you're going to see these kinds of margins everywhere for Democrats. That's not going to happen. But I can tell you this, it's not going to be the same 1-2% thing. By the way, the trifecta, Democratic governor, Democratic Senate, Democratic Assembly, that looks to me to be, if not a lock, a highly probable event. That is not something which we would have said a year ago.
Well, I think the margin was huge, right? I mean, it's bigger than any Shirley Abramson victory, and she was sort of the head of the court and the big vote getter for Democrats for all that time when she was there. It is a big margin. I think in the end, when you look at how much money each side had in this race, the margin becomes a little more understandable. When Chris Taylor and her team had 8 times as much money in this race as Maria Lazar, and Lazar never actually reached the level where everybody knew who you were, which happened in the previous couple races when we were spending $50 and $100 million for Supreme Court races. So I'm not as surprised by that. I do think it is a huge victory for Democrats. They now control for the foreseeable future one very important branch of government. You mentioned redistricting is one thing. I'd make one correction. You're right. If the Republicans try to gerrymander, this court will overturn it. If the Democrats try to gerrymander, this court might not even bring the case up. So just saying. The other thing that's important is that one of the most important votes that justices on the Supreme Court take is deciding which cases to take up. You're a lawyer. You understand they get hundreds of people who want to appeal their case all the way up to the Supreme Court. Then they only pick a small number of those cases. It takes 3 of the 7 justices to have a case taken out. There are only 2 conservatives left on this court at the moment, and you're suggesting after the next election there may be 1. So my team will have no say in what cases come before the Wisconsin Supreme Court. It will be entirely dependent upon the Democratic majority / supermajority that the Democrats now have on the Wisconsin Supreme Court. They won this in a very different way. The last few elections have been very different from the elections that we used to have in the 90s and early 2000s when I was running Supreme Court races, when both sides would compete to find the most experienced candidate, then go out there and get as many sheriffs and police chiefs to be on their team as possible, raise $300,000-$400,000, and then show up at all the bar association debates around the state. That model is long gone. Complete history here. You have a completely different model that involves raising a substantial amount of money, running on issues that the voters care about, even if they might not be cases that ever come before the Supreme Court. I'll be fascinated to see which case comes up before the Supreme Court that has to do with grocery prices, or which case comes before the Supreme Court that says we can stop Donald Trump. Generally, a state Supreme Court cannot stop a president's powers. I'm not a lawyer, but I believe that's actually right. So Chris ran on those, harnessed the voters' enthusiasm for her positions and opposing Trump, and that's how they got there. I think that will lead them to be sort of more less bound by tradition, I'll say, on the court. They were less bound in their campaign tactics. I think they're less likely to respect precedent and tradition. We're not electing people based upon judicial philosophy and experience anymore. We're electing judges who reflect the voters' views on a certain set of issues that are important at that time. And I think that'll be reflected in the court, and that will be a huge benefit to Democrats going forward.
Well, that's one spit to put on it. The other one would be that Republicans cause these problems and then they complain about them later. So, for example, Elon Musk spends $20 million in Wisconsin trying to buy an election, clearly being a partisan. And then the next year, the Democrats are going to win because people aren't happy with the Republican policies. I remember in the 1980s being the victim and as Senate Majority Leader, or just before that, when the Republicans in WMC decided to have independent expenditures. We said that violates Wisconsin campaign finance law. And the court said, oh, no, we're not going to do that. But those problems now with big outside money, now Republicans are complaining about it. The reality is here that people are now going to be voting on issues. Let's face it. They're going to be voting on issues in the Supreme Court, and values. And the Republicans actually did for a long time do the values, where I'm conservative and sheriffs and all these kinds of things, basically sending the signal that I'm going to be for you and make sure those people that are maybe part of the unwashed, we're not going to be in favor of them. Well, the Republicans started to do this instead of relying on precedent and some of the other things that lawyers find important in this. And now they're reaping the harvest. You reap what you sow. And, so to me, it looks like poetic justice. But I'll tell you this, I think what's going to happen here, Wisconsin is actually becoming a blue state. And this is the canary in the coal mine that shows it. The numbers that are coming out of Dane County is probably 40% of the growth in this state, net per population growth. And Lazar got 16% of the vote out of Dane County. Wow. 80-some% of the vote is going to the progressive. This means that for the fall, this has implications not just for future Supreme Court races, not just for redistricting. I think Scott's saying the same thing. But I'll tell you what, when you have a guy so dominant, the personality is dominant, something like Donald Trump, this guy now has broken the brand. Now, I know there's time before the election. There's a little less than 7 months, but there's not that much time. And usually these elections are a pretty good indication. And I think you're going to see some really dramatic stuff. And I think you're going to see a trifecta.
Well, I think we agree on 2 things. I think Tuesday night was a historic night for Wisconsin, and it will make a difference in many, many years to come. And second of all, Republicans need to fix their Dane County problem. They cannot just have the fastest growing, largest growing county in the state, at least, have their candidates win with 86% of the vote. You cannot stagger out of that county with 14%. You really can't. on our side stagger out with 23, 24%. You've got to figure out a way to get a quarter of the vote in Dane County. And we've got to change our pitch in order to balance the scales across the state and keep Wisconsin a 50-50 state.
Right. And you cannot lose Ozaukee County as they did last night to Chris Taylor, 52% or 53%. We'll see you next time, folks.
You've been listening to The Insider with Chuck Chvala and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership.